Welcome to Cold Steel, the Canadian Journal of Surgery podcast, with your hosts Amir Farouk and Chad Ball. The goal of the CJS podcast is threefold. The first is to highlight the best research currently being completed by Canadian surgeons. The second is to offer educational topics for both surgeons and trainees alike. And most importantly, the third goal is to inspire discussion, thoughts, creativity, and career development in all Canadian surgeons. We hope you enjoy it.
In this episode, we had the opportunity to talk to Dr. David Urbach. Dr. Urbach is a MIS and bariatric surgeon and health services researcher at Women's College Hospital in Toronto, Ontario. We had a really wide-ranging discussion with him, talking about everything from checklists to the impact of the word cancer on patient decision-making, to wait times in Canada and how we might address these wait times in the face of COVID, as well as medical devices in surgery. Take a look at our show notes for links to the papers, and we hope you enjoy the episode.
Well, first, Dr. Urbach, thank you very, very much for joining us on Cold Steel. We really appreciate it. In sort of thinking about you in a more broad context, I think you're probably Canada's best example of a true contemporary, maybe triple threat, so to speak. You know, you're a heavyweight clearly in research, you're a really busy administrator, and of course, a really busy clinician. So, again, we know how busy you are, and we can't thank you enough for coming on. I guess our first question out of the gate is, I think most of the country, quite frankly, knows you quite well, but maybe not personally. So we were curious what your pathway was in terms of moving into medicine, eventually surgery, and then, of course, your subspecialty.
Well, thanks, Chad, for that very, very flattering introduction. You know, it's really interesting to think about our history and our past and our pathway into medicine, and you really wonder how much of this was what you were thinking at the time, given, you know, what I've come to learn about this job over the years. But I do know I grew up in a medical family. Like, my dad was an obstetrician, and, you know, I'd hear him on the phone in the evenings, you know, having these like serious conversations with his residents and asking a couple of questions, and he'd say things like, you know, oh, is she shocky? Do I need to come in? You know, not really knowing what all that meant, but it did seem very exciting, and you know, I think that and what I saw on TV, the whole a career as a doctor just seemed like a really exciting and interesting way to be involved in helping people. And I was also, you know, I viewed myself as sort of a scientific person. I liked science and in school and biology, and it just seemed like a great way to pull all these things together. And surgery as well. It you know, as a young person, I thought like the greatest thing in the world would be to be up all night in hospital wearing scrubs and just doing heroic things to save people. You know, I'm over time, I guess, you know, priorities shift a little bit, and you know, I can say I really love taking call, and I love the acute side of the work that we do, but you know, I've definitely mellowed with age, and I don't live for the all-nighters at this point in my life, I will say.
It's funny that you say that you grew up listening to your father talk on the phone. I remember distinctly as a young kid hearing my dad at the table calmly pick up the phone and say, "Yeah, are they passing gas? What's the urine output?" And as if that was normal dinner conversation. Would you say then it was your dad who was the most influential person and kind of pushing you towards your career, or who would you say was the most influential person along the way?
You know, I think when I look back on it, I'd probably say it was him. And I don't know that that's true, but I can't imagine, because, you know, for him, his career was so crucial for him. Like, that's what he was. He was a doctor. He actually had a lab. He was funded by the MRC doing research in immunology, you know, back in the late 60s, early 70s. So he was like a real clinician scientist. And, you know, it was a career he completely loved, and he thought that was the most noble and important thing that a person could do. So I'm sure that was hugely influential on me.
Dave, we wanted to dive into a few of your publications, and I try not to use the word heavyweight often, but I really did mean that in introducing you. You really are one of our super heavyweights, maybe even in Canada for sure. It's impressive. You have multiple New England Journal of Medicine publications, of course. One of the favorite papers that we have around here, and I think you know this, having kindly come out to Calgary and give grand rounds a couple of years ago, was your, I wouldn't say retort or response, but your commentary and your work on surgical checklists and briefings. I was wondering if you could just sort of summarize that publication for maybe those few folks who haven't read it, and what your take on it was, of course.
Yeah, so what we did is we wanted to analyze what happened after the introduction of surgical safety checklists in Ontario. And what really prompted this was all this literature that was emerging that safety checklists were just incredibly, fantastically effective, more effective than any intervention that we'd ever seen in perioperative care at accomplishing things like reducing postoperative complications and reducing operative mortality. And if you actually look at the numbers, they're phenomenal. Use of a checklist compared with not using a checklist cuts the risk of death in half.
Exactly.
So, and Carl Sagan used to say, and we use this in one of our commentaries, that extraordinary claims really require extraordinary evidence. And, all the evidence, when you went back and looked at it, was not what we would expect for rigorous, high-quality evidence to support clinical interventions. These were really before and after studies. So there were no clinical trials or well-designed controlled studies. So study designs that we would ordinarily consider highly biased designs, and we would normally look very suspiciously at the conclusions from these types of studies, really led to an intervention that was actually adopted overnight. If you looked at the timeline when safety checklists initially were endorsed by the World Health Organization and the NHS in England and eventually throughout the rest of the world, this is something that within months became really much a standard of care in hospitals. And we took a step back and said, once they were introduced, did it achieve what everyone expected it would achieve? So if on all these early studies it reduced the risk of death by 50%, and if it reduced complications by a similar amount, does that happen when you actually introduce it at a population level? And the advantage of doing a population study like we're able to do in a lot of our jurisdictions in Canada, because we have these population-based databases, is you don't have to worry about selection bias. If you look at the entire population before, the entire population after, you don't really have to worry that, maybe checklists are only being used or used completely in certain populations, and that may make it seem like checklists are really effective, but it might really be some sort of selection bias that's operating. So what we were able to do was use the entire population data set, and essentially what we found is that at the population level, nothing much really happened. So all these anticipated benefits that we would have expected based on all these other small before and after studies didn't happen when you actually studied this at a population level. And that has actually been borne out in some other studies that have been done across large geographic regions, entire states in the United States, where it's been very difficult to show the types of benefits that were demonstrated in the early small studies. Interestingly, our study was largely criticized or interpreted to show that the reason the checklists weren't as effective as they should have been was because they just weren't done properly in Ontario. That was the perspective that we didn't invest in a proper rollout. We didn't really educate people into how to properly do a checklist, so they weren't doing it full with their full
exactly.
But and never was there sort of this consideration that, maybe it just isn't quite as good for these clinical benefits as people think. There was always this assumption that they must have this effect on operative mortality and complications. I do want to say, because this comes up quite often, that I'm not a checklist nihilist. Like I do believe that they actually have enormous value to us, and I enjoy doing safety checklists with teams that I'm sure a lot of us do. But I think the benefits are very different from what they were purported to be initially. And I really don't believe that they save lives, but I do believe that they bring teams together, that they engage nurses, they force us to know each other's names, and really engage as people. And I think they have enormous benefit, for surgeons as they exercise micro leadership in operating rooms and are able to really formalize the way that they bring teams together. So I like checklists. I'm very skeptical about some of the claims that have been made about them.
Why do you think those initial publications, and obviously, as you pointed out, the incredibly rapid subsequent uptake, were like they were? Like, why did they show such massive clinical benefits?
Right. So, those are two great questions, and I have my own personal answers for both. So, The first, I think the reason why they showed such huge clinical benefit is, I think the reason why so many of our studies of surgical procedures show really big clinical benefit. And I think the answer for almost every intervention that seems too good to be true is, why is selection bias causing this effect? Yeah. And to me, like selection, and non-surgeons and lay people really don't get the whole concept of how selection profoundly influences the types of patients that we look after and what we do for them and what happens to them. So, and what I mean by how selection bias would have influenced these studies, because at the Toronto General Hospital, we were actually a participant as one of the 8 hospitals in the initial World Health Organization New England Journal publication that really got the ball rolling.
I didn't know that. Wow.
Yeah, so I was one of the surgeons. We completed the yellow forms, and the way it worked is that they did this run-in period where they looked at all the operations over a 4-month period, or whatever it was, 4 or 3 months, and looked at the outcomes of all those patients. And then they had a bit of a washout, and then we introduced a checklist. And then we looked at the outcomes of patients who had this checklist procedure done. So in the after period, we had to fill out a little questionnaire about whether the checklist was done or not and just answer some basic questions. And those patients were then collected and became the after group. And the difference is the before group included everybody, but the after group only included specific patients that we had sort of checked off this sheet and enrolled and said we'd done this safety checklist. So the types of patients who may not have made it in that after period, and we've never really studied this very well, but I have to assume is that a lot of emergencies, a lot of reoperations, like middle of the night things, and ruptured aneurysms, you name it. Yeah. So to me, whenever I look at the results of studies, I always think my first impression is why is it that I cannot explain this by selection bias? And almost always, you can find how selection bias is likely to play a big role, and it's a very big problem in a lot of our research. So the answer to your first question, I believe, is I think selection bias was a big factor. The answer to the next question of like why was it popularized so quickly? I think there's a number of factors, but one is I think we were primed for these types of interventions, and the story was a great story. Like, here's this intervention, it can be applied internationally, it costs nothing, it's simple, and it's if you took it at face value, it's extraordinarily effective. And who's the proponent? Atul Gawande, one of the most well-known and persuasive and most thoughtful surgeon leaders at the time, who had written some books, who was very, very well known for his journalism in the New Yorker, and is an incredibly influential, persuasive, and smart guy. So I think the constellation of all these things really made it just irresistible, and that's why what we saw was this uptake like nothing I've ever seen with respect to changing practice overnight.
I'm curious,
whether when you read papers, is that the first thing that you think is there selection bias that could explain this? Because what impresses me a lot about this paper is the fact that you would actually think about it and think critically about the paper, because I think for the majority of us, we looked at it and thought, this is pretty unassailable data. And what motivated you, or how did you even come up with the idea to challenge something like this?
Yeah. So, the answer to your first question is yes. Every time I look at a paper, it's not, say, a really good randomized trial. My first thought is just, how is this not selection bias? Just for example, there was a CMAJ paper recently looking at surgeon age and outcomes. That's now sort of making the rounds and has a lot of buzz. I'm still going through it myself, so I haven't had a chance to dissect it. But again, I look at the conclusion and say, okay, experienced older surgeons may have fewer complications. But then my next question is like, how does not selection bias not come into this? Like, what exactly is the practice style of some of these older surgeons that you can't really dissect out through a lot of the risk adjustment methodologies that they've applied? And as someone who's done a lot of this type of health services research, I understand the limits, and I do, I have the familiar experts understanding that you really can't do the things that you want to do, which is pretend you've done a really high quality, well-designed randomized trial using just these observational data. So yes, that's definitely my first thought whenever I read any study. And the idea of trying to use population-based research as approaches to get around selection bias has been a theme that's gone throughout my research career. Whenever I try and assess the effect of any type of health intervention without doing randomized trials, which are extraordinarily difficult to do in surgery, as we all know, my thinking is always, well, how can we study the entire population and try and use the entire population to figure out what the impact of this intervention might be? So that's why we looked at that in particular for surgical safety checklists.
Yeah, I think that's an important lesson for trainees in particular, in that, we spend a lot of times learning what the guidelines say, for that little quiz that we have at the end of residency. But I think it's important to still remember that the evidence definitely might not be perfect, and to keep those considerations in mind. I wanted to shift gears a little bit to one of my other favorite papers of yours, which is the paper that you did, I think in last year, which was looking at the impact of the word cancer on people's assessments of risk in thyroid nodules. Can you talk about that paper for those people who haven't read it and what you found? Yeah,
and this is actually one of my favorite studies too, and there's a bit of a poignant and somewhat sad story, which is that I tried to do this the first time about 10 years ago in a really small study among men with prostate cancer, and what we did in that study is we just gave these hypothetical scenarios to men, like 60, 70-year-old men, and say, what would you do if? And we gave them a scenario where you had this thing, and was 1 centimeter, and it was in the prostate gland, and you could do one of two approaches. You could either leave it alone, in which case you'd be totally fine, or you could do the surgery, in which case there's a 50% chance that you would have impotence or urinary incontinence, and you would still be fine. So we basically gave the scenario of a localized prostate cancer, and we said, which approach would you most want to take? And when we called that prostatopathy, which was the word we used back then for that study, nobody wanted surgery, as you might imagine, because the scenario we gave them suggested that surgery was all harm and no benefit. And if you called it cancer, virtually every man who did this study said they would have surgery, like 95%. And it was a very small sample size, and the confidence interval was wide. And we sent this to JAMA as a research letter, and it went through like multiple rounds of peer reviews. And I thought it was like a done deal. And at the very end, I think they just they got cold feet, and it's one of those like great ideas that just never got published. And I never just sort of had the wherewithal to pick it up and run with it until I had this resident in ENT who was really interested in doing a project, and we just redid the same thing with thyroid cancer and did the same scenarios. You do a hypothetical survey among people with this thyroid thing, and if you call it thyroid cancer, everybody will want to have it removed, and if you call it a thyroid nodule, then very few people will want to have it removed. And the bottom line is, this tells me, and I think should tell all of us, that the words we use, and like just basic words, are highly influential in guiding how people make decisions about surgery or other treatments, especially decisions that we think are sometimes not rational or counterintuitive, especially for very low-risk neoplasms where all the guidelines would suggest conservative therapy. Prostate's a better example of that actually than thyroid, because there still isn't that much support yet for a watchful waiting approach to low risk but potentially malignant thyroid nodules. But for prostate cancer, for localized small prostate cancers in men, there's a lot of evidence that overall the best approach would be an active surveillance or watchful waiting approach. And what you see in practice is that men, even with localized prostate cancer, overwhelmingly elect to have surgery. And I have to think it's because we're calling it cancer. And people just cannot abide by the fact that they have something in their body called a cancer and not have it removed. It just, culturally, it just seems like such a counterintuitive concept that it's very difficult to provide guideline concordant care when it really goes against every emotional impulse that a person has when they're diagnosed with cancer.
That's such an important study, Dave, and it speaks even, I think, more broadly to just how we talk to patients in general. As an HPB surgeon, of course, even how you talk to them about dying is so heterogeneous from partner to partner, and some do it beautifully, and some do it less well. And the words, you're right, the selection of the words we use is so very important, and really frames not only how the patient views their scenario, but how they view their future as well, whether it's up front like you're describing and in prostate and thyroid lesions, or whether it's at the back end and you're dying of a pancreas cancer that's metastatic. It's such an important idea.
I think a word that we should think a lot more about, that we use all the time, is the word leak. When people talk to patients about complications, they'll often use, surgeons will talk about a leak.
Right.
And the word leak, like for the average person, like a leak sounds almost cute. Like it doesn't, when, like what a leak means to you and me.
The garden hose.
Yeah, like
totally.
But and the consequences, and reoperations and stomas and drains and a prolonged course. But it's like the word leak just does not do justice to the nature of that complication. So, and that's just an example of words and how influential they can be. So I think we really have to be aware in all the work that we do about the words that we use, and like you say, how we talk to patients, because there's a lot of variation, and there's really good techniques that we can pick up to communicate better.
I mean, in particular, and from the view of a trainee, you're going through your residency and you're trying to understand didactically and then technically all this information. But I think we all run across, once a year, twice a year, maybe more if we're very lucky, but a particular faculty surgeon in clinic that you see connects with patients over and over and over again in a way that is awe-inspiring, might be too strong, but really, really impressive. And I think all of us should probably, as we move through that process, sort of stop and try and reflect on it for exactly the reasons you're saying, because some people do it so well. Although it's a bit tangential, maybe, Dave, there's so many challenges in performing high quality research in surgery, and you've touched on them in the first half hour here a little bit, but from at least from our point of view, if we look around, in Calgary, some of us that try and grind along and do research, there's obviously less funding mechanisms. It's harder to get that money to support your study. There seems to be new barriers really every month, whether it comes from the university side of things on the ethics side, or now requiring trial insurance, or whether it's really our and I don't say this in a negative way necessarily, but our provincial government's really focused on clinical care as opposed to the academic side of things. Maybe less of a drive in the trainees to participate in research for a whole host of different reasons. It just seems like there's more and more challenges all the time. So I was curious on your view of what are those challenges in general, and then maybe some advice in terms of how we can overcome them, or what do you think of all that?
Yeah, I have to agree. It's so hard to do research and to practice as an academic in surgery, and just when you think it can't get harder, it gets even harder. And I have a huge admiration for those of us who still actually have active labs, like do real wet lab scientific research and get CIHR funding and keep that going when it's so expensive and competitive and time consuming that it's I have so much admiration for the people who are still able to do it. So I think one of the biggest barriers to developing academic faculty in Canada still is the way that we work in our universities, and we don't work the same way as a lot of American universities, for example, that can develop academic faculty who they basically hire new people who are well trained, pay them a salary, tell them, okay, you've got these clinical responsibilities, but this is your research job, and these are your research days, and this is what we're paying you for, and you're going to do this for 3 years, and we'll review you every year, and then eventually your promotion and your tenure will be based on how you perform in all these different dimensions. And in Canada, it's very difficult because of the way clinical revenues come in, and because of the way hospitals are funded, and because of the way our academic departments work. It's very hard for us to do that. We can try and put some plans together to protect young academic faculty and try and get them to sit and think and write and collaborate. But it's very hard to keep the drive to do clinical work at bay and to really put the rewards from clinical work into some prioritization, so that you're not so pressured to do clinical work to maintain your income and to contribute to whatever group arrangement you have in your hospital or university, which varies a lot, obviously, from province to province and university to university. So I think the opportunity, the ability to support people to be disciplined is very difficult for us in Canada, and I think that's a huge problem. And then the rest of them, you could make the list. It's so competitive. CIHR funding rates are between 10 and 15%. So yeah, you have to get rejected a lot of times at CIHR before you ever get a grant funded. And to do high quality research takes time, takes money, and takes training and collaboration, and put into all the other competing things that people need to do. It's just so hard. And I know I keep saying that over and over, but I really sympathize with our young faculty now trying to, starting out on their careers and trying to develop their own niche in research. And, I do what I can to support them, but I have so much sympathy for what they're dealing with because I recognize how difficult it is for them as well.
Dr. Ball had talked about not only you're doing this really tough work with research, but you're also involved in administration, and particularly you've looked a lot at trying to improve the whole Canadian healthcare system, particularly with wait times. What do you think are the big things that we should be working on as a country? I know it's a bit hard right now with COVID sort of looming on our minds, but if we back ourselves up 2 months and kind of think globally about the Canadian healthcare system and the issues that we're facing, what are your thoughts about how we could improve access to care and overall our system?
Right. So if I was to back up a couple of months, I would say, what's the biggest threat to Canadian Medicare? Like, if there's one thing that's going to topple the system and have the Supreme Court of Canada just say this is no longer consistent with our charter rights, it would have been access and wait times, for sure. Of all the concerns that people have, that's the one that hits a nerve and gets a lot of attention. And it's something I've been thinking about for a while. In international surveys, Canada performs, not great on health system performance. So, the Commonwealth does the survey every couple of years, and it was a real wake-up call where I think the 2017 one showed that Canada was, close to the bottom in international rankings. And the biggest reason that we perform poorly is access and wait times. And these are things like wait times for elective surgery, ability to get a primary care appointment within a day, like waiting for a specialist for more than a few months. And these are huge challenges. One thing I will say, because people sometimes lose sight of this fact, is that nobody loves their health system in any country. Like if you look at that Commonwealth survey about how people rank their health system internationally, like the country that did the best in the 2017 survey was Germany, and they asked questions like, are you mostly satisfied, or are there major problems, or do you have to destroy the whole health system and rebuild it from scratch? And in Germany, which was the best, 60% of people thought it was largely okay, that it didn't have to be knocked down and rebuilt, or did not require sort of major changes. So 40% of people in the best country, like in the country where people thought the health system was the best by international comparisons, 40% still had major problems with it. So I think the notion that there's a solution to the problems of providing healthcare in a way that's satisfying to populations in Western countries, like that's never going to be something that we're able to achieve, just because of the way that healthcare is now. That it's very expensive, and people's expectations of care is very high, and they want access to it. And it's like the classic line in business is good, cheap, fast, pick two. It's exactly the same in healthcare. Like, you can have, in Canada, I like to think we have, good and maybe cheap, but not fast. And you can have, fast and good. If you can argue that maybe the United States offers very good healthcare and very accessible healthcare, but it's not cheap. So, something has to give, just because people expect a very high standard of care, and that has become extraordinarily expensive. So, per capita health expenditures in Canada are around, they vary province to province, but like say $6,000 per year per capita. Nobody really wants to spend that much money. If you look at median household incomes and what that represents, whether people pay for care out of pocket or insurance premiums or taxation, nobody wants to shell out those dollars and think that that's going for their health care. So you have this basically unsolvable conundrum. So that's just my little sideways diatribe on the fact that healthcare systems can't be fixed; they just have to be managed. So Canada, the biggest crisis point to me has been the issue of wait times and access, especially in surgery. I think that's our challenge. And the approach that I've become most interested in recently has been looking at innovative ways to manage referrals to surgeons and innovative ways of how surgeons work together to provide care. And the best model that I can find in the literature, and it's one that we're studying now in Ontario using administrative data, is what are called single entry models. So single entry models, everyone's familiar with. If you go to most Tim Hortons or banks or whatever, you just join a single line in the beginning, and then at the very end, you just get assigned to the next available person who can provide you a service. And there's a lot of literature on single entry models in healthcare. So essentially, your family doctor wouldn't have to figure out which surgeon to send you to, who might have the shortest wait time, who they think is the best, whatever goes into the minds of referring physicians when they try to find a surgeon to look after a patient, but that you would have a common queue, and then the patients would just be assigned to the next available provider. So if in Ontario, down the street, I know there's a great hernia surgeon in Toronto who has a wait list, or this is before this whole COVID thing started, somewhere like 12 months or 18 months to see him for an inguinal hernia, and other hernia surgeons had a wait list of just a couple of weeks, and primary care doctors have no idea about who's got the shortest list. Like, we don't really publicize all this information, but if there was a common list for hernia surgery, and patients would just enter this common list and just get partitioned out to the next available provider, all of a sudden what you've done is you've sort of harmonized that wait list and gotten it down to kind of the lowest median wait that you could have, because you're pooling all the resources together and just using a common queue. So the concept of a single entry model, and people sometimes call this central intake or centralized triage models, but the notion of having a common queue and then assigning patients to the next available provider can go a really long way in harmonizing wait times and shortening wait times for most people. The other approach that I think helps quite a bit as well is establishing team-based models of care. So right now, a lot of surgeons, for most of what we do, still work as essentially solo providers, and we kind of run our own practices, and we get referrals of patients, and we evaluate them and decide whether or not they should have surgery, and then generally we do the surgery ourselves. Sometimes there's a bit of group input through tumor boards, for example, and for some cancer sites, but by and large, surgeons manage patients on their own. The alternative is to have team-based or group models of care, where care of patients is shared between surgeons in a program. So say at a hospital you have 3 or 4 surgeons who work together to co-manage patients. The way that can also help wait times is once a patient enters into your program, they also just get assigned to the next available surgeon. So if you happen to see a patient in your common program, but you don't have OR time for like 2 months, and one of your partners has OR time in 2 weeks, then that patient could actually go and have surgery primarily by your partner instead of by you, and still get the quickest next available appointment. So that model is a little bit different from the way that most surgeons work, and there's a lot of reluctance to embrace different types of models. But I think you could do a lot to improve the system dynamics and improve access to care, and probably also improve the work lives of surgeons by embracing some of these innovative models of care a little bit more than we have in the past.
It's interesting, Dave. I think you're dead on as usual with that. We just recently had the Edmonton group come down to Calgary and give grand rounds about their program up there. They call it an access program, but effectively that's exactly what you've described as what they've done. And it was interesting to hear, in terms of adoption and sort of a negative view of it amongst some surgeons up front, and how that, it was the minority, but that relatively vocal group up front had all come onto the program at the back end, because they saw it be so successful, not only for patients, but also for the surgeons themselves. They talked about reducing a lot of the administrative stresses that they individually, as well as their offices, had to deal with. And it was a remarkable presentation, which we're trying to pursue it in Calgary here. But, as you say, there's a lot of skeptics, in particular, maybe surgeons that have been around for a long time and have deep relationships with referring physicians. Probably they'll be the late adopters, but the data was very clear. It was significantly beneficial to Northern Albertan patients and really surgeons at the end of the day too.
Yeah. Well, change is hard and painful, and but I will say I think you're dead on that. Once people implement these types of programs, they never go back, and wherever
Exactly.
they're like, there's so little back. And a great example, and I'll go back to my dad, the obstetrician who is obviously retired, but he spent his whole career until the very end of his career looking after his own patients.
Mm-hmm.
And he'd like at 3 a.m, he would, on a Thursday, he not on call, but he'd have to, if one of his patients was in labor, he'd drive down to like the Wellesley Hospital in downtown Toronto and go and deal with a woman who was laboring and deliver her baby or section or whatever. And that people now would look at that as craziness, like obstetrician.
True.
Like, and here, women, because people will often say that, oh no, a patient won't tolerate this. Like, once you have that relationship formed with a surgeon or a provider, then that's inviolate, and that there's no way that patient will ever allow anyone else or have confidence in any other provider. But just look at obstetrics, and there's so many other examples. But here you have pregnant women who see their obstetrician periodically, every week towards the end of their pregnancy, developing strong relationships, I'm sure, with their obstetricians. And then when push comes to shove and you're in labor, it's let's meet Dr. Smith, and whether you have a section or forceps or whatever the obstetric decision making is, you basically trust the person who's there, and it's not the person you had a relationship with before, but it's the best person who's skilled and inspires confidence, and they can look after you in the moment. So, to me, there's no reason why it's not possible. And I think surgeons often will do things and value them, particularly when it helps them as well. And I think as surgeons realize how much improves their work lives as surgeons, and you mentioned just the stress of managing a practice and patients and wait times. Like, our lives are almost all workarounds for system problems,
yes,
right?
Totally.
Like,
exactly.
How do you do this? And it's one workaround after another, and it's all just done to preserve this notion that we own the patient. It's our patient, and we have to figure out, with the resources that are given to me, like, how am I going to get this? Like, how am I going to get this person done? I've got these 4 other people, but if you shift to a system perspective and say, the patient doesn't necessarily belong to you, it's a patient of the system, and how can you construct a system to provide patient-centered care? Then you open a whole new universe of creative ideas.
Well, if COVID has done one good thing, it's shown us that we have to probably get a bit more innovative and maybe have to embrace change. People are doing telemedicine consults, for example, and that's not something we thought was ever going to take off in the way that it has. But talking about wait times, how are we going to address this backlog of cases after we have elective surgery turned back on? Once whether COVID is going to go away or not it remains to be seen. But once the elective surgeries sort of start taking off again, what are we going to do about this massive backlog, and what are your thoughts about how to best address this?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it probably won't surprise you that I think team-based care and single entry models are a big part of how we're going to address this problem. My personal feeling, and none of us know what's going to happen, but I don't see this as a problem that we're going to get beyond in a couple months' time, and then say, okay, how are we going to dig ourselves out of this backlog? Let's operate Saturday and Sunday and every night till 10 p.m. just to get through all this backlog of elective surgery that's accumulated now that we're over the hump. I think probably we're going to be managing or coping in some way with COVID for many months and possibly a year or more. So I don't see us as getting, back up to 100% of capacity, let alone, 150%. So I think we're going to be stuck with what's probably an ethical problem for the foreseeable future, which is how do you provide care to people with limited resources, including sort of care that kind of falls between the cracks. Like, we might be able to construct a system that gets all the patients with breast cancer and colon cancer and hepatobiliary cancers, but is nobody going to have a knee replacement for the next year and a half, or a hernia repair, or a cholecystectomy? We have to figure out a way to do this fairly, ethically and equitably to patients and also to surgeons. If you're a benign general surgeon who does benign surgery like hernias and gallbladders, there's a scenario where you might not operate for months. What does it mean to be a surgeon who doesn't do an operation for 6 months or 9 months? So I think we need a way to treat patients ethically in patient-centered manner, and I think we need a way to keep surgeons working. Number one, because it has to be fair to surgeons, and number two is, the catastrophe. If you force surgeons to basically stop working for a long period of time, you may not get them back. I'm not sure what happens to people's skills after a prolonged period of time. It's not ideal for anybody. So what I view as a very effective and ethical and fair system is to say, look at what do we need to do and what are the resources we have, and what's the most fair and ethical way to do it. So, and again, you're not going to be surprised, but I think working together in teams and sharing resources equally. So instead of just who's got the most patients on a list, let's just let everyone get equal access to resources, so all the surgeons have a chance to keep their skills up and get access to resources for patient care, because I think that's important for surgeons. And then for patients, I think we need to work off common lists within our groups. Like, if you're in a hospital with a few partners, I think we all need to put our patient list together and say, okay, let's prioritize them based on urgency and try and get the urgent ones first through the list, but also make lists for everything so that we don't ignore some of the benign conditions that still cause a lot of suffering and chronic problems for people. So, I think the same types of strategies that would be good for Canadian healthcare in normal times are even more important in these crazy crisis times.
That's well said, Dave. Well, one of the passions you and I share for sure, and I think lots of us share across the country, to be honest, and I just wanted to touch on it before we close, is especially our concerns around implantable medical devices, and that's a broad description, a broad term, but obviously in the general surgery world, for example, we would talk about some of the many types of mesh that have been, say, recalled for incisional hernia repairs. As you know, there's, in fact, the largest class action lawsuit in America right now surrounds a dual-layer mesh. In Canada, it's ramping up. We tend to, at least from my point of view, drop these implantable devices into patients in what seems like a very rapid and sometimes unsafe manner, based on data and opinions from industry. And I don't think that's the fault of the surgeon necessarily, but it certainly is a concern. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, this is such a fascinating area, and I've done a lot of work with device regulation in Canada, and also read a lot about how this works internationally. And I think it was fascinating to me because I knew so little about it before, and I can guarantee you that most surgeons really don't understand the process by which these implantable devices are evaluated, regulated, and approved. And here's what I mean by that. In Canada, it's Health Canada. That's the agency that regulates and provides licenses for health products. In the United States, it's the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, and every country has its own process. And the legislation used by Health Canada, as well by the FDA, basically says that they approve health products if they're safe and effective. So those are the criteria. Now, if what they're evaluating is a new drug, to determine that new drug is safe and effective, they've decided, based on this, evolving consensus, that requires large clinical trials. And for most drugs, it's there are thousands of patients in placebo-controlled studies. They're obviously funded by pharma, because at the end of this is a company that stands to get a lot of return on investment. But because of that, you can actually get fairly well-designed clinical trials that actually can tell you that a drug is effective and largely safe. Although even with these, big expensive clinical trials that the pharmaceutical industry does, people still criticize them because, follow-up was only 1 year. Like, we don't know what happened after 2 years or 3 years or something. But at least they have these big clinical trials. So the amazing thing is, for implantable devices, there's really no requirement for clinical trial. And at first you may think about that and say, well, that's crazy. Like, how can you approve new implantable devices without doing, randomized trials or controlled trials in people that are large enough and well-designed enough and long enough with follow-up to figure out if they're safe and effective? And as it turns out, when you dig deeper into it, it's extraordinarily difficult to do that, and I would say impossible, mostly because of how expensive it is to do these types of studies, and the fact that the manufacturers of devices could never ever recover the costs of development if they had to actually pay to do clinical trials. So to put this in perspective, drug studies, to get these things approved by the FDA, are hundreds of millions of dollars by and large, and people argue whether it actually costs that much and where the money goes to. But it costs at least tens of millions of dollars, probably hundreds of millions of dollars per product to get it on the market with clinical trials. And so you can do that with drugs because you get market exclusivity and patents, and you get 18 years or 21 years or whatever it is to sell a drug at a high price with essentially a monopoly market. But you don't have that with devices, because they're not patented molecules, and different manufacturers can provide similar products. The intellectual property doesn't stick in the same way that it does for drugs, and the products don't stay in the marketplace that long. So you can't actually, develop a piece of mesh, patent it, prevent any of your competitors for creating a similar type of mesh, and then market it at retail prices for 20 years. The meshes change every few years. So the whole business model just makes it unaffordable to do clinical trials. And the other problem is that the sheer number of devices. So, people may not realize this, but new drugs, every year there's like a handful of new drugs that are approved by Health Canada or the FDA. It's like maybe a couple dozen, but less than 50 for sure every year. Whereas for medical devices and implantable health products, it's thousands. Like there's probably many tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of medical devices that have licenses that are being marketed, and it would just be an overwhelming, task to do the same type of regulation that people do with drugs. So the problem with devices is we have exactly the same language from the regulators that that they use for drugs with devices. So they'll say that yes, this mesh is approved because we've determined it's safe and effective, but if determining something is safe and effective actually means doing clinical trials with long-term follow-up, they actually haven't done that. Like, all they've done is they've gone through what's largely an engineering process, or they've done enough due diligence to show that it's not too different from other types of meshes. And that's really the evidence that gets the mesh on the market. And I think surgeons don't understand this, that the process by which these implantable medical products get to market don't necessarily rule out the fact that there may be problems. There may be long-term problems, there may be short-term problems, and you can't foresee all these problems. And I don't blame the manufacturers. because I do see this as a very it's a very complicated problem. But one thing we need to do is change our mindset about how we think about all of these products and implantable devices, and sort of think of them a little bit more as experimental things rather than approved known quantities. And I think if we thought a little bit more of them as always somewhat experimental, I think we'd be much less likely to use the latest thing. Like, I think we'd be much more likely to use the mesh that we used 10 years ago and 15 years ago that seemed to be pretty good. But once you start to change your mindset and you try and reduce your susceptibility to the latest and greatest, which is such a normal human emotion, I think it would all make us all better off.
You've been listening to Cold Steel, the official podcast of the Canadian Journal of Surgery. If you've liked what you've been listening to, please leave us a review on iTunes. We'd love to hear your comments and feedback, so feel free to email us at podcast.cjs@gmail.com or connect with us on Twitter @CanJSurge. Thanks again.